The Bridgerton of hockey is officially here, which means it's time for another installment in the series, The Romance of Sports. If you're new here, I'm Marissa, and I make videos that make sports more accessible to people who typically feel cut out of them. And one of the series I've been doing for a long time is The Romance of Sports. In this series, I take sports romance novels or television shows or movies, and I explain all of the sports context that adds to the relationship, as well as some of the things you may not know about the sport that can help you understand the romance and the relationships in the show itself a little bit more deeply, and also to see how sports romances do a really good job of not only utilizing the sport as a setting and a plot device, but also in a way that enhances the romance specifically because of the sport, and in a way that has made an extreme correlation of new fans of sports because of those romance books. The last installment in this series was, of course, Heated Rivalry. Over the course of 6 episodes, we broke down every single piece of that show and how hockey itself really influenced the romance not only between Ilya and Shane, but also between Scott and Kip. And I think that that show had this seismic impact on people becoming hockey fans for the first time, which is why when Off Campus was announced, I knew that we would have another influx that kind of lines up in a really great way. I do think it's important to note that these two shows have nothing to do with each other, and one show was not made because of the success of the other. This is sort of one of those things where it happened to be developed at the same time, and Heated Rivalry ended up being such a surprise smash hit that Off Campus will inevitably benefit from the audience that was built there. However, Amazon Prime didn't make Off Campus because Heated Rivalry was so successful. So I want to get that discourse out of the way right at the top, because I do think that this show is another really fun one. And one of the reasons I was excited to start breaking down this show is because I do think the off-campus books were a very big part of this hockey romance book talk era that made new hockey fans. The off-campus books came out a while ago, and I feel like I've never seen a book talk recommendation of hockey romance books that didn't include at least one of them. And the fandom that was built out of those books is a pretty strong one. For me, this was before I was really involved in the hockey romance space, and I'm excited to go through the TV show as a TV show. I'll be breaking down the context of the show, not the books. I do know there were a lot of changes to the television show from the books. I did the same thing with Heated Rivalry. All of those breakdowns were in the context of the television show without thinking about the books. So when we're talking about the canon of this show and how it relates to the romances, we're just talking about the facts that are in the television show and not things that you would know if you had read the books or things that had been changed. That being said, this show of course came with a massive built-in audience, and I'm excited to see how many new hockey fans we get out of this television show, especially given the fact that it does break down a lot of stuff that you wouldn't think about watching just a typical hockey romance that's set in the NHL. Off Campus is actually set in college hockey, and it gives us a lot of opportunity to talk about things like the draft system, NIL deals, legacy in hockey, and of course the dynamics of falling in love before you go pro. So for this video, I'm just going to be breaking down the very first episode of Off Campus, the Prime television show. If you've at least watched the first episode of the show, you won't have any spoilers because I won't go past episode 1, and we'll go through episodes 2 through 8 as we go through the rest of the installments for The Romance of Sports. For those of you who don't know anything about the world of Off Campus, the reason people are referring to this as the Bridgerton of hockey is because this series is set to follow a very similar format. The books that the show is based off of follows a group of hockey players who are all on the same team and best friends in college, and each book follows a different one of their romance plot lines. So with this one, the first romance is Garrett and Hannah, but moving forward, we'll have a different romance pairing that are the leads of each season. The show was already renewed for a season 2 before the first season even aired, and so I do think we're gonna have a lot of hockey to talk about over the next couple of months. So without further ado, let's dive into episode 1. Now, one of the things I was curious about with this show was what the production value of the hockey would actually look like, and we get an answer to that right at the top of this episode. We cut in between Garrett and Hannah in the ice rink while they're going through their sort of nightly routine. Garrett is actually on the ice practicing by himself, clearly outside of a required practice for the team, and Hannah is working one of her many work-study jobs, which apparently seems to be being involved in the actual hockey locker rooms. I'm not exactly sure what her job was, but this job does come up a number of times as like a repeated kind of plot device here, and it does give her a reason to be in the ice rink. To some degree, it looked like an equipment manager job. To another degree, it was sort of like a janitor job. I don't think she's officially an equipment manager because that would put her really in the face of the team and everyone would know her very well, but it does give her sort of a reason to be in the ice rink, even though it's not necessarily very clear what it is. Garrett, on the other hand, is set up as a player who's very focused on being very good at hockey and practicing outside of the requirements in addition to normal practice. Garrett has the rink to himself, which visually is very fun. I personally never played D1 college hockey, so I don't know how realistic it is that you're able to just get the rink at all times, but it does seem to be a repeated theme in this show, where characters are actively able to just get the entire rink to themselves, no Zamboni, no people involved in this, and the rink is just completely open. Like, I think every single one of these guys seems to have a set of keys to the rink itself, But I digress. I actually really like how much hockey we see in this show. And right at the beginning, we're seeing Garrett kind of drill some basics. And because most of the skating was pretty decent here, I was kind of curious to see how much training the actor had gone through to be able to skate. And the answer is his stunt double is actually an NHL player, which is why it looks so good. One of the stunt doubles for this show is actually an NHL player named Vincent Iorio. He plays for the New York Rangers currently, but previously he was on the San Jose Sharks, and before that he was on the Washington Capitals, and before that he played for the AHL. And one of the cool things about the timing of this is actually that Vincent had sort of a tough season last year. This show was filmed in Vancouver, and it was done last summer in 2025. And at the time, Vincent didn't actually know exactly what his NHL career was going to look like. At that point, his contract was owned by the Washington Capitals, and he was trying to earn a position on that roster. Ultimately, he was put on waivers, which is basically where a team that owns your contract can say that they no longer want to have you on, and any other team can then claim you and put you on their roster. The San Jose Sharks then claimed Vincent, and he was on their roster where he played 21 games last season, before the San Jose Sharks ultimately put him on waivers as well, and then he was claimed by the New York Rangers. And in the midst of all of this, he had just spent a summer actually filming off campus pretending to be Garrett Graham. I think there's something really fun in that lore, and also if you've already watched the show a little bit, you know the significance of the New York Rangers to this story. And if you haven't watched the show, one thing that's relevant is just that the New York Rangers and the Boston Bruins are in the same conference, which means that ultimately they do play games against each other, they're in close proximity, and they do kind of fight in the same conference to get to the Stanley Cup. Overall, just from a production standpoint and a hockey perspective, I thought it was really cool that they decided to use a real NHL player to double Garrett Graham. And you really can see it in the production of the hockey aspects of this show. There are a lot of game scenarios in this show. We do see quite a lot of ice time in a way that I was kind of surprised because the cost of shooting things like that is very high. And we do get to see in this opening scenario a player who does know how to skate, which does kind of add to our visual understanding of Garrett Graham and him being one of the star players of this team. I also think if you watch the show and you decide to get into the NHL, there's this fun Easter egg of a New York Rangers player that you can now root for because he is in some ways Garrett Graham. And of course, he has this story behind him of a player who's really fighting to stay in the league. He's been playing his whole life, he's been fighting to get into the league, and he's been put on waivers by 2 different teams. He's bounced between coasts multiple times, and now he has his shot with the New York Rangers. So off the bat, for people who really get into this show, there's already a player who can actively help you get into the NHL and have someone to root for. I also think there are some really fun ways to get to know Vincent and his personality. If you watch some of the stuff from his 2023 NHL Players Association highlight showcase, he's a goofball, he was mic'd up, he's very sweet, and it's fun to have someone to root for if you've never gotten into the NHL. This feels like a really fun way for a player who maybe wouldn't have gotten attention before to go a little viral and have a new fan base. So from a production standpoint, I thought that was really fun when we see that in the opening. And then another piece of this character that we get very instantly is this back tattoo. Now, the back tattoo was chosen by the actor who plays Garrett Graham. It was his idea to have these Latin words inscribed on his back, which go right underneath the last name on his jersey. And what they translate to directly are, "There is no free lunch." And I will say, when they released this back tattoo as one of the images that was pre the show coming out, I was sort of like, oh, okay. But as sort of like hit you in the face as it is, I do think it comes very clearly down to a lot of Garrett's character, and a lot of that is based in hockey. Garrett's reminder that there is no free lunch is sitting directly underneath his last name on his hockey jersey, and that name is what connects him to his father. Now, a large portion of Garrett's backstory, and of course how he deals with his relationship throughout and his character and the way that he interacts with Hannah in the first place, come down to the fact that he is a legacy player. And we know for a lot of this episode and a lot of the way that Garrett and Hannah's relationship actually starts, it comes down to this idea that Garrett doesn't want to be handed anything. Not just from the idea of being a nepo baby, but also from the idea of being a hockey player at college that's getting a pass just because he's a hockey player. As we go through this episode, we find out in their sort of official meet cute and the circumstances that are pushing them together. And I will say, I'm not counting the meet naked as a meet cute. This feels like a separate one. But ultimately, Garrett's reasoning for wanting to be in Hannah's space and get to know her is because he needs help with class. And it is suggested directly by a number of different characters a number of different times throughout this series that Garrett could just have his coach talk to the professor and pass him so that he can play. But Garrett is resisting this and wanting to actively earn his position. And to really understand that desire to earn everything that he has, which becomes a core reason why him and Hannah even speak, we have to really understand the hockey context that comes into this show very quickly right at the top. To really understand Garrett's character, you have to understand how the NHL Draft works. In this show, right at the top, we get this montage where we're talking about who Garrett is and his prospects in the NHL and the fact that he is a top prospect. We also, in this montage, get the fact that he was drafted by the Bruins. Now, if this is your first time really interacting with hockey and the professional hockey world and how the NHL connects to the college hockey world, it may be confusing why a player who was already drafted to the NHL is playing in college and not for the Boston Bruins. And that's because the NHL draft works very differently than other drafts you might be familiar with from other professional leagues in North America. When we look at other professional leagues like the NBA, the NFL, the WNBA, all of those leagues have age requirements of entering the draft, and they require you to declare yourself for the draft, and then once you're drafted, you go and play in the professional league, and you can no longer go back and play in the college leagues. Declaring for the draft and being drafted for those leagues makes you no longer an amateur player and now puts you in the professional space. So you are giving up the ability to play NCAA for those sports and making your leap to playing in the professional league. And once you make that change and you are drafted, you head to that team and start playing for them. The NHL does not work like that. For the NHL draft, once you turn 18 years old, you are now in the pool that can be drafted. And the way the NHL draft works is that players are being drafted when they turn 18, but they're not necessarily going to go play for those teams immediately. When you get drafted to the NHL, it means that that team now owns the rights to your contract. But usually it's going to be really top prospects at 18 years old that actually go straight to the NHL. The NHL draft has 7 rounds and there are 32 teams in the league. A standard draft is going to have 224 players that are drafted, and not all of those 224 players go directly pro. When we're talking about first round draft picks, those are the players that are most likely going to have a chance to head directly to the NHL right at 18 years old. We talked about this in the Heated Rivalry breakdowns about how Shane and Ilya were such top draft picks that they would have headed straight to the league. In the real world, we see the same thing. Last year's first overall draft pick was Matthew Schaefer, who went to the New York Islanders. He went straight to the New York Islanders, he started playing this season, and he ended up winning Rookie of the Year. The year before Matthew Schaefer was Macklin Celebrini, who went first overall in the draft and went straight to the San Jose Sharks and has been one of the best players in the league since he arrived, and there are plenty of other stories just like that one. However, if you're not a top prospect at 18 years old when you're drafted, you don't go straight to the team that drafted you. There are 2 other options that could happen. 1, you could go to a minor league affiliate of the team that you've been drafted by. Or 2, you could do what Garrett Graham did, which is go play college hockey. So off the bat with this episode, we know that Briar U is a Division I hockey school. This means that they are highly competitive and make a lot of sense for a player like Garrett Graham, who's already been drafted into the NHL, to continue playing and continue developing his game. But one of the really important tension points that you may not understand about Garrett's character if you don't understand how the NHL draft works is that when players have already been drafted to the NHL, at any time Garrett could be called up to the NHL. That's what we call it when you literally receive a call from the NHL team saying that they want you to come play for them. In that moment, you have to decide if you want to take your chance at the professional league, which would potentially be your only shot, or if you want to give all of that up and continue your college education. At that point, when the Boston Bruins did call him up, Garrett would sign his entry-level contract and become an official NHL player, which would then mean he would no longer be able to play for Briar U and, of course, finish his college education. And this is a real thing that players are dealing with. When you are drafted to the NHL, that team owns your contract and they can call you at any point and say, we're ready for you to come play for us. So it's actually relevant to think about this for Garrett as a whole character in terms of the pressure that he's under. Every day that he's at Briar U is a day that he's not in the NHL, and he knows that he has this opportunity ahead of him, but he has no idea at what moment that opportunity becomes reality. And also, every decision that he makes while he's at college could be jeopardizing that opportunity that he has with the Bruins. If he doesn't continue to be the best player that he can be, continue to work on his skill set, at any moment he could be called up to the Bruins and leave Briar U behind. And he could also get there and not be good enough. He could find himself on waivers and get dropped from the team and hope that somebody else picks him up. He could find himself sent down to the minors and not be able to go play college hockey and finish his degree, but also not be sure if he's going to earn a place back on the NHL roster. All of the conversations that we're hearing about Garrett Graham being a top prospect for the NHL are exactly that. He's a prospect. So I think the biggest context we get from the hockey side of things in this episode is really why Garrett is the way that he is. From the very top of this show, we're introduced to this character who has this one-track mind when it comes to hockey. So much so that he's not willing to have a girlfriend, which is a pretty core thing in this romance. But once you understand the fact that Garrett already has this huge level of pressure on him, and there are two factors of it that we already understand at the very beginning of this episode. One, he has already been drafted by the Bruins and has these aspirations of becoming an NHL star, but he wasn't such a great player that he went went early on and went straight to the NHL. Garrett isn't a first overall draft pick or even necessarily a first round draft pick. What Garrett is a really strong NCAA center who's already been drafted to the NHL but still needs to prove himself to actually get into those contracts. While Garrett has been drafted, he doesn't have an entry-level contract yet. And every moment that he spends at Briar U is a moment that he could get injured and find himself never making it to the NHL, or a moment that he could allow distractions to take away from his future and not be good enough to actually make it all the way there. And once you understand how the NHL draft works, understanding his character is a little bit easier, and it adds a little bit more depth to this standard womanizing sort of I don't do girlfriends hookup type of archetype. There's a real reason why he doesn't, even if that does seem still a little bit of a stretch. Garrett is focused on this future, and as we understand while we go through the rest of the guys, we quickly learn that he is the only one on the team that already has this draft pick. But one thing that is important to understand is a number of times throughout this episode, it's referenced as a guaranteed sure thing with the Bruins. And it very much isn't. Being drafted by an NHL team does not guarantee you in any way, shape, or form a game where you actually step foot on NHL ice. It does mean that he has a significantly better chance than any of the other guys who did not get drafted, but it doesn't mean that it's a certainty. And I will say one thing that does happen in this show is that we break one cardinal rule of romance for me, which is that we see the romantic lead be intimate with someone else before they're intimate with the character that we want them to fall in love with. It's always just a tough one for me. I guess it's not necessarily a cardinal rule, it's just like a cardinal rule for me. It's tough for me to root for someone after they've been intimate with another character, even though obviously we know that this is going to happen and that this is happening. I just don't necessarily want it to be happening on screen for me personally. However, one of the reasons I'm willing to excuse it here and let it kind of happen is because of the conversation we have directly after that hookup. There's a very big misunderstanding where this character expects that she is going to be Garrett's girlfriend. And Garrett brings into this conversation this idea of not doing girlfriends and explaining why, and saying that it is 100% tied to hockey. For Garrett, he's looking at this future that he has. He talks about how he has to be 100% committed and focused on hockey, and that his life is morning practices, games, and thinking about hockey some more. And this character points out that all of the other guys that live in this house have the same schedule, but Garrett kind of snootily says none of the other guys have a deal with the Boston Bruins. And this is important, and it's also true. The other guys in this show are undrafted, which doesn't mean that the other three guys that we're seeing in this show won't end up in the NHL eventually, but it does mean that they're not good enough to be in the NHL right now. Going undrafted is a completely different path to the NHL than getting drafted and going to college before you go to the NHL. For Garrett, he's good enough that a team like Boston does want the ability to own his contract when he does go pro, but he's not good enough to go pro right out of high school. For the other guys, it means that they still have a lot to prove. They didn't get drafted, meaning that they're good enough to play NCAA Division I hockey and play it very well, as we hear about the idea of them winning the Frozen Four and how focused they are on their future of this team. But the other guys on the team, it's actually more important for them to be doing well on the ice at Briar than it even is for Garrett, because they are still trying to make it into the NHL at a lower level than Garrett already has done. For most of these guys, their path would either be attempting to get drafted into the NHL right after college, or going to play minor league hockey and hoping that their performance there is good enough to get called up to the NHL affiliate. And so this moment where we're talking about him being the only one to have that deal makes him kind of sound like a douchebag off bat, but it's actually a very big point. It shows the pressure that all four of these guys are under. For Garrett, he's already been drafted, but he's not good enough to play in the NHL yet, and everything he does could affect that possibility for him in the future. For his friends with Dean, Tucker, and Logan, they all still have something massive to prove, and every mistake that they make on the ice is another strike against them. So underneath it all, when it comes to the other guys in this house, there's going to be a level of jealousy when it comes to the way that they look at Garrett, not just from the fact that his dad was in the NHL and a big deal, but also from the fact that he's one step closer to all of their dreams. And I think that's in particular highlighted in his relationship with Logan. And so in this morning after scene that we have, it really does reflect everything we talked about with the pressure and the focus that he would have to have in the draft, but also highlights a lot of the group dynamics in the fact that he has this one thing that everyone wants, and it seems like he's gonna get a lot of the other things that other people in the house want too. And then we get the first sort of in-depth reference to who Garrett Graham's dad actually is. This comes in a conversation between him and Logan inside the house that they're sort of inhabiting as though it's a frat house. Garrett's phone background in this scene also is literally a picture of an empty ice rink, which I did find very funny, very locked in on a singular focus, and that is hockey, 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 guys. But the reason we see that is because he's getting a text from his dad asking him to talk to him. And Logan is having this conversation with him about his dad and the pressure that comes with it. In that conversation, Garrett says that people expect him to be just like his dad. And in that, John Logan says that if Garrett wants to be just like his dad, Phil Graham, he just needs to win a Stanley Cup, a Norris Trophy or two, and spend more time on his hair than a Kardashian. Now, the references here do tell us how big of a deal his dad was in the NHL. The Stanley Cup is the NHL championship, which is a very big deal, obviously, and the Norris Trophy that John is referencing here is called the James Norris Memorial Trophy. That trophy is given to the NHL's best defenseman every year. It's one of the awards that are voted on by the Professional Writers Hockey Association, which you heard me talk about in the last episode of The Romance of Sports when we were talking about Scott Hunter's acceptance speech for MVP. But basically, there are a ton of awards in the NHL, and a lot of them are really specific. The Norris Trophy is one of those. It's very specific to the all-around best defenseman in the league. Now, Logan's comment here tells us that Phil Graham was a defenseman and one of the best. Not only did he win at least one Stanley Cup with the New York Rangers, he also was the best defenseman in the league. However, one of the things that's important here and really stuck out to me is that Garrett Graham doesn't play defense. If you're not familiar with hockey in general, there are 6 different positions that you can play on the ice. Obviously, you have your goalie, and then we have 2 different groupings for the other 5. They're split into offense and defense. So you have your offensive line, which is made up of your forwards, and in those positions, you have a center, a left winger, and a right winger. Now, your forwards, your center, left, and right wingers, are going to be very specifically focused on scoring and running the team's offensive strategy. The other 2 players on the ice that are not the goalie are actually your defensemen. Your defensive line plays in pairs, left and right. Now, we know that Phil Graham plays defense, but we also know that Garrett plays center. We see Garrett taking the face-off when games start, and we also know this from the sort of montages that we're getting of people talking about Garrett and the rest of Briar U. For Garrett to play center, it means that he's a very fast skater, a good scorer, and a very good leader. And for a character that is spending so much time in this first episode as we're being introduced to him, worried about being in his father's shadow or being compared to his father, it also marks a pretty clear choice on his part early on in his life to not play the same position that his dad played. And in fact, to play a completely different position, not even on the same line or the same type of play. And it's pretty significant to understand that Garrett as a character and as a hockey player is really focused so much on not being like his father. He's focused on playing a completely different role for the team. He's focused on being a leader, a positive scorer, a positive impact, versus being someone who's guarding the goal, trying to make sure that the other team doesn't score, and potentially getting into a little bit more fighting. Overall, this is pretty quick in terms of like how much we hear about it on screen, but it is pretty relevant for the character building. And once you understand kind of what those positions look like, what their role is on the ice, and the fact that Garrett would have had to make that decision pretty early on because the training is different as well, we understand a lot about Garrett as a character. He's been drafted by an NHL team, but he's not so good or a prodigy level type of talent that he still ended up going to college hockey. We find out later that he's a junior in this season, meaning that he also has played 2 full years of college hockey and is in his 3rd and still hasn't been called up to the NHL. So again, not prodigy level talent here. But we also know that it's very important to him not to lean on this idea of legacy or be like his dad. And we know he has this mounting pressure of when will he make it to the league, when will the Bruins want him, and when will he be good enough to play there? And how many choices can he make on the way there that are helpful for that rather than harmful? So when Logan says no one's expecting you to be like your dad and references that Norris Trophy, there's also a little bit in there of saying your stats can't even really be directly compared to your dad's because you guys play completely different roles on the ice. But while his stats may not be able to be compared directly, we are of course going to see his name and his legacy constantly be linked to his dad's last name, which goes back to the back tattoo of "There's no free lunch" right underneath the nameplate. Now, I know we haven't talked a lot about Hannah in this episode, and that's because most of their conversations don't have a lot to do with hockey. However, they do have this conversation in Malone's where Hannah says that hockey is the only non-combat sport that doesn't penalize fighting but encourages it. And this is a little bit of a technicality, but something that's important to understand when we're talking about NCAA hockey versus NHL hockey. Fighting is not allowed in NCAA hockey. You are going to see very physical hits and body checking, but in the NHL, you will see actual fists fly. You will see players drop their gloves, get into fights, and then be penalized for doing so after the fight is over. However, NCAA hockey, it's strictly prohibited to actually get into a physical fist fight. If you do get into a physical fight in NCAA hockey, meaning gloves are taken off and fists are thrown, you not only get a 5-minute major penalty, which means that your team has to play shorthanded for 5 minutes, you also are ejected from that game and suspended from the next one. And the other big difference you can see there is that you actually see these players wear face cages rather than kind of visors, which is what you would see in the NHL. Players in college hockey are not supposed to be fighting or hitting each other in the face, and if they do, it's a pretty intense penalty. However, it is still a physical game, and Hannah's point of kind of this idea of allowing people to fight and be this physical is a real thing. But the idea of them fighting without being penalized isn't exactly correct. You do still serve a major penalty in the NHL when you do fight, and also if it were to happen in NCAA hockey, it would be an extreme reaction. However, her point here really stands in terms of their romance and their character, which is the idea that hockey is a violent sport and it's not something that she is particularly interested in, and that it could be a little bit of a roadblock in their relationship or even their ability to be friends. The next big hockey chunk that we have here is Garrett Graham's dad showing up to campus. One of the first things he says is, "You made captain finally," and Garrett says that I'm a junior, which actually is pretty relevant. Garrett being captain as a junior is a pretty big deal, and the idea that he should have done it faster is pretty not normal. But we immediately see the tension between Garrett and his dad and this idea of him trying to live up to his expectations. We also see that Garrett's dad intensely affects him mentally when it comes to the game. And one thing I thought was interesting in the portrayal of Garrett's dad at this game is that most likely a number of people would have at the stadium been aware of Phil. We don't see this on screen, but I do think in addition to the kind of shakiness that we see Garrett having just from having a conversation with him, and also from seeing the way that his friends who are hockey fans react to his dad being around, and a couple of comments that are made throughout the episode about Garrett and his relationship to his dad being a legend and how the other guys would love for him to be their dad, all of those things are kind of needling and building this tension. But one of the things that would have definitely happened is that when Phil actually shows up to the hockey rink to watch this game, he also would have been swarmed with people. There would be people there that are big hockey fans, that are fans of the NHL, that know who Phil Graham is. There would be people kind of asking for his autograph, asking to take photos, and all of this would be happening while Garrett was warming up for the game. It would be in full view and something he would definitely be getting into his head about. And we do get a very clear understanding that Phil's presence is something that throws Garrett off of his game in terms of the first period, but it's relevant to know that it would also be this level of stardom showing up every time he comes to a game. And given the clearly strained relationship that Garrett has in the first place here, that would also be this intentional stealing of the spotlight on Phil's part. So before we really tune into Garrett at the rink, remember that that is the level of fame that his dad would be bringing. And as much as Garrett is trying to escape his dad's shadow, we're also having him actively overshadow him in his own space. This is also the part of the episode where we see Garrett kind of directly compared to his dad, and we also find out that his dad was a Ranger, which was the sort of Easter egg that I mentioned at the beginning when we're talking about the production value of the actual NHL player being involved. And again, I actually really enjoy the way the hockey is shot in this show. I think it's pretty cool that they're using a large amount of on-ice action. I do think you can tell when it's the actors and when it's a stunt double just based off of the camera angles that they're choosing, but of course they should be doing that. I enjoyed watching like how much gameplay they're working into this show, and I think that it'll also help people get excited about watching real hockey outside of this show. I'm curious if you are watching this show and you've never watched a hockey game before, have the hockey sequences made you interested in the game, or are they kind of fun to watch? But I do think it points out something in hockey romance specifically that I've found does help people get turned into fans of the game, which is that as you look at hockey romance, whether it's on screen or on the page, a lot of times you get excited about how fast-paced the game is and how intense it is. And then you think, well, I kind of liked the intensity when it came to the context of the romance. What if I just turned on an actual game and saw if I liked that? And of course you do. So I do think the level of effort that the production team put into the quality of the hockey sequences should be commended, because it's something that is really hard to do just because of how expensive it is. And also it's really hard to shoot fictional characters playing a real sport and make it feel believable. This first period that we have is obviously very tough. Garrett is clearly in this mental hole when it comes to the game, and they're playing their rivals. Now, if you've never watched hockey, hockey is played in 3 20-minute periods with intermissions in between. And an intermission is the period of time in between the first and second period and the second and third period. Now, I will say that this is the portion of the episode where we do start to see the romance part of it take over the hockey part of it. An intermission is less than 20 minutes, and that starts the second that the clock stops on the first period. So these guys have to get off the ice, back into the locker room, towel off, have a snack, take their helmets off, also listen to their coach in this point kind of be frustrated and try to figure out how to get them back on track, rehydrate and get their gear back on and get back onto the ice. The possibility of Garrett leaving the locker room and running into the depths of the stadium and finding Hannah playing the piano is pretty slim to none, and that definitely would take longer than the actual intermission period. I do think it's a sweet moment. It does show both of them dealing with their underlying kind of trauma and backstory and getting to a point where unknowingly Hannah is the reason why Garrett's able to get back on the ice and be able to play well. However, in terms of timing, it's pretty unlikely. Garrett does obviously go on to win the game 6-2 in a pretty intense way, and that's all because of his ability to lock back in, having seen Hannah, which is very romantic and very genuine. And And then of course we get Garrett finally being able to lock in with Hannah on this kind of fake boyfriend plan. I do think that this is one of the most guy level plans that we see, and I honestly enjoy it because it does show like men really understand men in a specific way. But Garrett basically says, if you want this other guy to like you, you have to appear completely unavailable, and of course not only unavailable but liked by the hottest guy on campus. He points out in here that he is the team captain, the highest scoring player on the team for the last 2 seasons, and also that he has a bit of an ego. I do really love this conversation between Garrett and Hannah because we do get this idea that Garrett doesn't really love hockey the way that you would think he does. Garrett's really good at hockey, he understands hockey, and he's using hockey as his kind of focus for the rest of his life, but he never really had a chance to choose it for himself, and he's not really sure that he loves it in the way that Hannah talks about loving music. What Hannah represents in this conversation and in this romance as it's just getting started is the idea of what freedom would look like if you were allowed to pick what you only wanted in life, and the desire to keep kind of pushing towards that goal. And for Garrett, that is completely foreign. Everyone that he's around and surrounding himself with has exactly the same dream, to play in the NHL. And he's grown up from the very beginning underneath the shadow of his dad, who was a huge top-level prospect and top-level player in the NHL. He would have seen the Stanley Cup in his house after his dad won it. He would have grown up around the New York Rangers and around the rest of the team. All of Garrett's dad's friends were probably hockey players from the NHL. And so hockey to Garrett is something that's inevitable, not something that he really truly loves and chose for himself. And Hannah, as we see in this intro episode and their relationship starting to build, and of course in that intermission period where we see Garrett get grounded by Hannah without even speaking to her, represents the idea of loving something so freely that you're willing to chase after it, which is something that Garrett appears to be visually jealous of in this episode, and also kind of confused by. And then of course we end on his idea of I don't believe in favors or shortcuts. And this is such a core thing to Garrett's character, as we've talked about here. We know that Garrett probably hoped to go first round and go straight to the NHL when he was drafted, but Briar U gives him the opportunity to live a life outside of his dad's shadow, outside of the NHL, and outside of his future for at least 4 years. And even though the Boston Bruins and his future in the NHL are constantly hanging over him, for a little bit, for a slice of his life, he can spend time with friends, and he can spend 4 years really trying to earn everything that he is going to get in life. Not believing in favors and shortcuts, not believing in free lunch, and not believing in the idea of legacy being the reason that he should have everything is really important to Garrett's character, and it's really important to the way that their relationship is going to unfold. So when it comes to Off-Campus episode 1, I do think that we set up so much context of who Garrett's character is and subsequently how that character interacts with women as a whole and also with Hannah specifically. And so I do think that Off-Campus, at least for episode 1, really passes this test that we kind of put these shows to, which is that the sport aspect of the romance is entirely important for the actual romance to take place. Garrett's character would be a completely different character if we were talking about a standard college romance or even a college romance that's talking about other sports. If we were talking about a basketball player here or a football player, neither of those players would have this idea of the draft hanging over them. They wouldn't know that they have a future in the league. They would be fighting for the possibility of getting drafted at the end of their college career. If we were talking about a college basketball player, they would be thinking about when they want to declare for the draft. For the NBA, you have to only be 1 year out of high school. You can declare for the NBA draft after your freshman year. The NHL is the only league that we would be talking about with this idea of a player not only being drafted already, but not having the agency to decide when they go pro and when they leave college behind. And so as much as Garrett wants to stay at Briar and as much as Garrett is focused on his future, he also lives in a space where he does not have control over his life. And I think that that is a really important aspect of his character as he falls in love with Hannah. So I hope you've enjoyed this breakdown, and I hope you've learned a little bit more about hockey in the context of this show, and also about how all of this really folds into the show and why it matters for this character, why their romance wouldn't be the same if it weren't for hockey. There are 8 episodes of this show, and we will continue doing the rest of the series for the romance of sports. I will be honest, I have not completed my binge. I've watched a couple episodes, but not all of them. So next week we will jump back in with episode 2. Until then, make sure you're subscribed so that you don't miss it. Drop any questions that you have for episode 2 and maybe episode 3 in the comments down below, and I'll make sure to include them in my breakdown of the next episode. And if you haven't checked out the rest of the romance of sports, be sure to go back and watch the episodes that we did on Heated Rivalry, as well as some other books that we've covered. You can find all of those in the playlist that this video is in, and you can also find them on my profile. And you can also watch You Are What You Love, which season 3 just premiered on Wednesday with an episode on Star Wars The Force Awakens. Every episode, a new guest joins me and talks about the piece of media that changed their lives as a person. And Jen Markham, who's a cosplayer, talked about how Rey changed the course of her life. You can find that on my page as well. Next week's episode of You Are What You Love will be about Heated Rivalry as well, so there is a ton of hockey romance coming your way. Be sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of that, and I will see you next week week as we break down episode 2.